My name is Colonel Miranda Hale. I am 43 years old, and I have served in the United States Air Force for over 20 years. I have commanded rescue squadrons in the worst deserts and mountains. And I have been awarded 3 air medals for pulling people out of danger when everyone else thought it was over. I have flown through gunfire, storms, and the kind of darkness that swallows sound. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the silence that waited in my grandmother's living room on the day of her will reading. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and dried lavender. Every polished surface reflected the soft light of the afternoon sun, but it felt cold. I stood near the doorway wearing my service uniform, the jacket pressed but worn at the cuffs. My boots scuffed from the tarmac of distant bases. My hair was tied neatly back. No makeup, no jewelry. Around me, my family gleamed like they had been born in a magazine spread. Silk dresses, diamond earrings, gold watches, catching every ray of light. They had flown in from their cities and vacation homes, perfumed and polished, ready to divide up a life. "You'll get nothing," my sister Evelyn hissed, her lips curling into a smile that could cut glass. The words snapped through the room like a whip. A few cousins chuckled. Someone whispered, "Poor soldier," just loud enough for the sound to reach me. Laughter followed, muffled by manicured hands. Evelyn turned to the cluster of relatives behind her and said, "She thinks the uniform makes her special. Look at her boots worn down to nothing." One of my younger cousins lifted his phone and I saw the red recording light. A second later, he muttered to the person beside him streaming this caption, "Broke soldier comes to beg at grandma's will." Hilarious. The sound of a notification pinged from his phone. Someone out there was already laughing at me. My heart pounded, but my face stayed calm. The same discipline that had kept me steady when flares exploded across a combat zone now held me here, rooted, silent. I thought of the night I crouched behind a broken wall in Kandahar, waiting for the extraction chopper with 2 injured airmen under my arms. Panic had no use then, and it had no use now. The room buzzed with soft conversations, brittle laughter, and the clink of ice and glasses. I kept my hands behind my back and stared at the family portraits lining the wall. Generations of Hales smiling in oil paint, their eyes avoiding mine. The lawyer, Mr. Preston, cleared his throat. He was a silver-haired man in a dark suit, his face as composed as marble. He placed a thick leather folder on the table and opened it with slow, deliberate movements. For a moment, he glanced in my direction, and I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Acknowledgement. Maybe even pity. That was when the room fell into a hush, the kind that makes your chest feel tight. My sister straightened, her jewelry catching the light like sparks. My parents leaned forward with eager smiles, ready for the confirmation of what they had always believed, that the soldier in the corner was invisible, forgettable, disposable. The lawyer began to read the official documents. His voice was even and professional, each word landing like a stone on a still pond. To Evelyn Hale, he read, "The primary residence at 125 Oakage Lane, the condominium in Naples, and the majority of the cash assets, estimated at $6.2 million. Gasps and murmurs rippled around the room. Evelyn's mouth curved in triumph. She didn't even try to hide it. She glanced at me over her shoulder, her eyes glinting with cruelty. To Thomas and Elaine Hale, he continued, "My parents, various investment accounts, and the vacation property in Martha's Vineyard." A polite chorus of congratulations rose from the relatives. Glasses clinked. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs, looking directly at me. "You see, Colonel," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Some of us know how to make Grandma proud. And you? You'll get nothing." The laughter was sharper this time. My palms warmed, but I didn't move. I felt a deep stillness settle inside me, the same calm that comes right before a storm hits. Then Mr. Preston paused. He closed the folder and pulled out a single yellowed envelope, edges soft with age. The handwriting on it was unmistakable, looping, firm, my grandmother's hand. He looked up at the room. This letter, he said, was to be opened only in the presence of Colonel Miranda Hale. Every sound in the room seemed to vanish. Evelyn's smug smile faltered. My parents exchanged a quick, nervous glance. I stepped closer to the table, the floorboards creaking under my boots. Mr. Preston slit the envelope and unfolded the letter with care. His voice softened as he read, "My fortune will not go to the greedy. I leave my true legacy to the one who has lived with honor, asked for nothing, and held this family's name with quiet dignity." He looked up and met my eyes. "Congratulations, Colonel," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's all yours." The room froze for a heartbeat. No one breathed. Then Evelyn's voice shattered the silence, raw and jagged. No, this is wrong. This is a joke. It can't be her." I drew in a long breath, steady and deliberate. Inside, there was no gloating, no sudden joy, only the gravity of the moment pressing down like the weight of my flight. Helmet. My eyes moved slowly across each stunned face. My sister pale and shaking. My parents stiff as stone. The cousins with their phones half raised, recording disbelief instead of mockery. The hook was set. They had laughed at the poor soldier. They had said I would get nothing. And now the fortune, the house, the land, and the name itself belonged to me. I didn't say a word. I let the silence do what words never could. I stayed silent as the room around me slowly erupted into whispers, denial, and sharp breaths. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me. But inside, my mind drifted. Somewhere far softer. My eyes wandered to the window, where sunlight broke through the lace curtains and touched the wooden floor. That was when the memory rose up like a warm tide, carrying me out of the cold hostility of the present and back into the summers of my childhood. I remembered the smell first. This house had always carried the fragrance of dried lavender, tucked into tiny fabric pouches in the drawers and closets. Grandma said it calmed the heart and cleared the mind. When I was 8, I used to follow her through the hallways, the scent trailing after us as if the walls themselves were breathing. Outside on the porch, the wind would catch the old chimes she had hung by the door. They weren't fancy, just copper tubes and a wooden disc. But when they sang, the whole yard seemed alive. That sound is stitched into my memory like the hum of an engine on a night flight. I saw her again in my mind, small, strong, with a sun hat that tilted when she bent to tend her flowers. Her hand was warm when it wrapped around mine, guiding me down the garden path lined with marigolds and daisies. We would stop by the fence where the honeysuckle grew, and she would crouch to meet my eyes. "Smell this," she would say, and I would inhale the sweetness like it was a secret. That garden was my first runway, and she was the only one who believed I could take off. One afternoon, after I had spent hours lying in the grass, staring at the sky, I ran inside with a notebook I had taken from my school bag. It was plain and cheap, and I had started drawing airplanes on the first page. Grandma watched me for a moment, then left the room without a word. She returned with a small leather-bound journal. Its cover was soft and warm from her hands. She placed it in front of me and said, "Every pilot needs a logbook, even if the only flights are in your dreams." I still remember the feel of that first page beneath my pencil as I wrote my first entry. "I want to fly where no one can tell me to come down." My letters were crooked and the pencil smudged my fingers, but she smiled as if I had already soared across the horizon. That notebook became my first true possession, the first thing I protected. Like treasure. I carried it into the fields, up the attic stairs, and even under the covers at night with a flashlight. Sometimes I would wake in the dark to find Grandma sitting by the window, looking out at the wind-stirred trees. She had this way of watching the world like it was a living story. One night, I crawled to her side and she wrapped an arm around me. One day she whispered, "They will understand the real value of who you are. You won't have to explain it. Just keep living with honor." Her voice was soft, but it sank deep. past the doubts that had already started to grow in a house where other people's approval was a currency I never held. Back in the present, I could still hear that whisper. My hand drifted to the inner pocket of my uniform, where the old journal rested. Its corners were frayed, the leather cracked, but it was still with me through every deployment, every base transfer, every lonely night. In barracks, while my relatives chased inheritances and social appearances, I had carried this tiny book of dreams and flight paths across continents. The living room felt smaller when I returned to it in my mind, the arguments and gas fading into a dull hum. I could still see the Merolds from years ago, the sun cutting golden edges around Grandma's hat. My throat tightened, but not with sadness. It was something heavier, a mix of love and the quiet ache of being known by one person when the rest of the world chose to look away. That bond was why I could stand there without flinching while Evelyn and the others mocked me. My grandmother had built a shield inside me with her belief layer by layer in every warm afternoon and every whispered word. She had given me more than land or money or a house with chimes. She had given me a compass, pointing to who I really was. The room snapped back into focus as a cousin's voice rose, sharp and incredulous, arguing about the will. I breathed in slowly, tasting lavender in the back of my memory and straightened my shoulders. I knew in that quiet corner of my heart where her voice still lived, that this day was the day she had prepared me for. The wind outside rattled the chimes, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like she was here, reminding me that patience and truth always take flight, even through storms. The voices on the other side of the parlor door snapped the lavender haze in my head back into hard edges. I eased closer, the brass knob cold under my palm, and listened. I knew better than to storm in. I had learned on flight lines and broken airstrips that patience can be a weapon. Mother said, we file for an emergency competency hearing. We argue undue influence. We ask the court to freeze everything before she moves a dime. Dad cleared his throat. The sound reminded me of a safety being clicked off. We lean on her service record, he said. Comat stress, insomnia, isolation. We position this as a tragic case. The public will understand. Evelyn laughed. The laugh was thin and expensive. I have a crisis manager on speed dial. We drop a profile about the poor soldier sister who lost her way. Give it 48 hours and the sympathy fund will drown her out. Mother added, we petition for a psychiatric evaluation. Judges love paperwork. The colonel will fold when she sees the forms. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. Training teaches you to breathe through noise. I counted 4 beats in for out. She is unstable, Evelyn said. Look at her boots. She lives in barracks. She has no home. This house would overwhelm her. Dad. The letter was sentimental. Courts prefer numbers. We mentioned market values and taxes and fiduciary duty. We will sound reasonable. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced down. The lock screen bloomed with a video frame from the live stream that had started during the reading. A cousin had captioned it. Poor soldier shows up for the jackpot. Watch the moment she realizes grandma left her crumbs. The comments stacked like shell casings. Should have picked a real career. Salute the hustle, not the uniform. Another clip zoomed on my hands. Someone wrote, tremor alert. Another replied, PTSD, princess. We argue that Miranda is isolating grandma's legacy. Mother whispered. We say she plans to liquidate the land. Judges hate liquidation stories. They think of farms and family. Evelyn said. I know an expert to discuss blast injuries and mental fatigue. People eat that up. Dad lowered his voice. The words still carried. We file an injunction tonight. We describe the colonel as a flight risk. Courts like those phrases. They sound official. No judge wants a headline tomorrow. I pictured their strategy boards, arrows, timelines. The same way I had mapped rescue corridors against mountain wind. It almost impressed me. Almost. My thumb found the edge of the old journal in my pocket. leather cracked and familiar. I steadied my breathing and let their words keep spilling. Mother said, we remind them she never visits. She lives. Out of a duffel. She is married to the sky. No stability. Evelyn, I will call. My influencer friend. We craft the narrative. Ship. Poor soldier stays on top of the feed. Pity converts to leverage. The knob cooled under my palm. The metal remembered winter. I released it and stepped back. I had learned a long time ago that you do not win by shouting through a door. You win by choosing the ground and the weather. I slipped down the hallway past portraits that would not meet my eyes and opened the front door. The porch air was cool. The chimes moved lazily. Beyond the fence, the tall grass rippled like green water under a steady wind. I stepped onto the boards. They creaked the way they always had when I was 10 and racing toward the garden. Out there, the fields bent and straightened. The horizon was clean. The sky did not care about hashtags or hearings. I let my shoulders settle, my jaw unclenched. The cold narrowed to focus in my eyes. The wind carried the scent of lavender from the house and the iron tang of old nails from the porch. It smelled like memory and resolve. I watched the grass move as if a hand were smoothing it in long strokes. I breathed once more and made my choice. I would not answer their door. I would not chase their cameras. I would fight on quiet ground with proof. With patience, with law. The chimes lifted and fell, a steady cadence. Somewhere in that rhythm, I heard my grandmother's voice clear as morning. Hold your course. I kept my hand on the porch rail until the chime steadied. The wind over the field carried me back to a harsher wind made of sand and heat. 7 years ago, I served as mission lead for a combat search and rescue tasking in a valley that did not want us. A sandstorm rolled over the ridges like a living wall. Grit hissed against the fuselage as we flared into a controlled fall. 2 airmen were down beyond a rocky rise after an engine fire. We had to reach them before the storm erased the map. The sky wore the color of rust. Small arms cracked ahead. Round stitched geysers into the sand. The team flattened, then flowed forward in short bounds. Fear tried to speak. Training broke it into parts one could carry. 12 seconds for wind, 30 for time. The ridge loomed, a broken knuckle. We found the first pilot tucked behind a slab where the wind could not take his last warmth. He was conscious and stubborn. He tried to stand. I put a hand on his shoulder and said we would bring his co-pilot back. Promises are currency out there. You spend them before you earn them. We patched him, marked his position with a panel the storm tried to eat, and pushed east along a cut that smelled like metal. A round snapped past my ear and bit a chip from the wall. We hugged stone and listened. Echoes blurred into noise. I crawled to a ledge that traded comfort for horizon. The world narrowed to a circle of glass. Tan on tan. A figure crouched near a darker smear of scree. The angles were wrong for a survivor. The rifle rested too patient. UPS slope. A second posture waited. Same stillness, same intent. The wind whispered its numbers. I slipped the sling, settled the rifle, and let the stock press a stern reminder into my shoulder. Wind left to right at 8. Half mil of hold. Count to 2. Choose the seam between gusts. When the first head turned, I broke the shot. The body folded as if a string had been cut. The second rose fast, trusting speed over thought. He rose into the hold, and I sent him down. 2 shapes stopped being problems. I tapped the team forward and felt the storm swallow the sound. We reached the second pilot tangled in parachute lines near a thorned wash. His breathing was wrong. Every inhale sounded borrowed. Our medic went to work. I covered the open ground and watched the horizon for new math. A third shooter probed from the right at a bad angle. The wind tried to unspool the path. I threaded the shot, and the medic said, "Thank you," without looking up. We cut lines, sealed a chest wound, and built a carry plan that asked for timing. On a till, the valley turned to a brown ocean. Rotor wash kicked a tide. The ramp took the first pilot, then the second. I counted breaths at a pulse. For in, hold, for out. A loop that says, stay with me. The escort bird. Checked in late. When the voice finally arrived, my shoulders dropped an inch. We lifted into grit and followed a sliver of sky. People ask whether I was afraid. Fear is a lever. You pull it when you need the edge. You release it when it starts to pull you back. What I remember most is detail. Dust under a balaclava, the tack of a glove when dried blood says, hold still. The stretch before a decision and the snap that follows when metal answers muscle. I tell it plainly because the plain parts carry the weight. If there is tremor in the telling, it arrives later in rooms where clocks tick too loudly. We brought both airmen home. The paperwork used proper nouns for courage and restraint. A citation landed in my hands. I kept the radio transcript because the thin strip of thermal paper still remembers heat. Years later, lawyers will say combat stress and insomnia. They will be correct in a way that means nothing and everything. I will not decorate their claims. I will hold my silence the way I held that ridge with patience and a clear field of fire. I learned a simple thing in that storm. Not every fight is won by louder voices or harder hands. Sometimes victory belongs to the one who watches, to the one who waits for the right second and spends it without flinching. I kept that lesson as I keep my grandmother's journal, close to the body, ready when wind begins to rise. Again. I left the porch when the chime settled and climbed to Grandma's room, the air still shaped by lavender and starch. I set my cap on the dresser and opened the top drawer. At the back, my knuckle found a seam that felt wrong. I pressed. A soft click answered. A shallow panel moved inward. Behind it sat a metal box, dull gray and heavier than it looked. The brass key from the wheel turned with a small sigh. Inside lay a flash drive taped to a thick envelope with my name in her looping hand. I sat on the bed and slid the letter free. I unfolded it and read, "My Miranda, if you are reading this, the house is loud. People speak louder when they are afraid. You will not win by shouting. I prefer plans. The accounts you will not see in the packet are held at Whitestone Trust under a custodial number. Mr. Preston knows the contact. The assets are not the point. The conditions are I executed a second instrument that is precise and narrow. Any person who cuts you off from me, interferes with your correspondence, or publicly soils your name forfeits any claim that might otherwise pass to them. I have appointed a trustee to enforce this without delay. You will hear talk about combat stress and fatigue. Let them talk. Your service is a ledger I admire. I kept records they do not know exist. Hallway cameras, phone bills, certified letters returned marked refused, dates and times. Mr. Preston holds sealed copies. The enclosed drive contains an index and a mirror. If anyone claims confusion, I have signed an affidavit before a notary describing what I saw and what I was told to believe. Truth is quiet. It needs a keeper. The flash drive wore a tiny paper label that said chimes. Downstairs, the wind moved the tubes. The thin notes climbed the stairwell. I opened my field laptop, slid in the drive, and a prompt asked for a passphrase. I typed the word that holds every summer here and watched folders appear in rows. Hallway west, foyer. Mailbox, front porch, calls, affidavit, amendment. I opened the affidavit. Her signature was steady, the notary seal clean. She described Evelyn collecting the mail and sorting it into two piles, one for Grandma and one for herself. She listed dates when messages from me were managed, redirected, or turned away. She wrote about my visits between rotations and the way I slept on the sofa when I had to leave before dawn. In the calls folder, scans of bills showed numbers circled in blue ink. The entries matched weeks when I sent postcards and received silence. In the mailbox folder, images of envelopes bore my name, then a stamp that read refused. A clip in the front porch folder showed Evelyn telling a neighbor I would skip Thanksgiving because I was too busy being a hero. The date matched the night I reached the House at midnight and found it dark. I opened the amendment. Mr. Preston's letterhead sat above a narrow clause that weighed more than its length. Anyone who cut me off or smeared me would lose everything that remained. Forfeit was automatic upon proof. The trustee was ordered to act. No flourish. No anger, only precision. Reading it, I felt a cold clarity settle in my chest. She had not guessed at betrayal. She had measured it, mapped it, and left me the coordinates. I closed the laptop and returned the drive. I folded the letter and slid it behind the fly leaf of my journal. Out in the hall, voices rose and fell. Strategy tried to dress as concern. The chimes lifted. The wind shifted. My eyes cooled to a steadier color. The quiet fight had already begun. My grandmother had placed her pieces without drama. Now it was my turn to move with the same patience. I tucked the key into my pocket and felt its small teeth against my fingers, a reminder that plans can be gentle and still cut true. I would not chase noise. I would let proof do its work. I would let proof work quietly. I came downstairs at first light and found a courier envelope on the foyer table. The return address was my parents' law firm. The crest gleamed behind glass. I slit the seal and slid out a stack of papers titled Petition for Emergency Guardianship and Temporary Injunctive Relief. In measured clauses, they alleged I was unstable and susceptible to undue influence. They asked the court to freeze assets, appoint a guardian, and order an immediate psychiatric evaluation. I read the petition like a flight checklist, line by line, then again for traps. They quoted journals on combat stress and insomnia. They listed my deployment dates like time zones could diagnose a mind. An expert they hired wrote an opinion without meeting me. Using photographs and headlines, he labeled me high risk for impulsive decisions. He recast discipline as rigidity and vigilance as paranoia. He spelled my rank correctly and my character poorly. The exhibit stung more than the petition. My mother's declaration claimed I had withdrawn. That structure ruled me, that I avoided parties. My father wrote that I was brave but married to risk, that the military trained me to see threats where none exist, that a state required softer hands. A cousin recalled a barbecue when a car backfired. I turned toward the sound fast. They tried to alchemize caution into weakness and memory into defect. I squared the stack on the dining table and looked at my reflection. In the curio glass, a woman in uniform stared back with calm eyes. The cuffs were worn from flight lines. The jaw had learned weather. I carried the packet upstairs to my grandmother's room. Lavender waited in the curtains. Dust moved in the light. The chimes kept time. The room smelled like summer and resolve. It reminded me how to breathe. By noon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Evelyn on the porch with a man in a navy suit behind her. She held a folder and a pen. Our father's voice drifted from the walkway steady. Evelyn kept her eyes on the page. We need to move quickly. The court needs clarity. This is a formality. Her smile was tired. Our father said, sign your statement. It will reassure the judge. I did not argue. The porch boards creaked. The chimes answered the wind. Evelyn signed her declaration. The pen scratched a loop. Pressure darkened the line. When she passed the folder back to the messenger, her fingers brushed mine. Heat. Then a retreat like touching a stove. For a breath, her eyes lifted and doubt broke the surface. The man in the suit thanked her. Our father nodded, already speaking into his phone. I took the new documents to the writing desk and opened the metal box my grandmother left me. I laid the filings beside her. Affidavit and the amendment that ordered forfeit for anyone who smeared my name or blocked my calls. Paper met paper. With a soft accord, I logged the time in the back of my leather journal. Habit is a runway when weather turns. I listened until the quiet felt like a shield. Beneath that quiet, I heard their plan forming. Guardianship would open the vault. A freeze would starve my ability to act. An evaluation would paint me with a brush chosen by their paychecks. They hoped I would lash out in public and confirm their story. I stepped to the window and watched tall grass lean in wind. The field did not care about filings. It moved and returned, patient, as tied and stubborn as stone. At 4, a deputy knocked. His uniform was neat, his face professional and kind. He handed me a summons and an order to appear. The petitioners requested temporary restraints, barring me from moving funds or altering records until the hearing. He glanced at the flight badge on my jacket. Respect crossed his eyes like a brief salute. I signed his form, thanked him, closed the door, and placed the packet beside the complaint. This was the micro spike, the moment that tempts noise. A different person might call reporter or flood a feed with rebuttal. I chose the lesson the valley taught me. Watch, measure, move once. With purpose. I anchored the papers with my grandmother's journal and breathed lavender. The wind pressed the chimes into a melody. My pulse matched their rhythm. I stepped onto the porch, scanned the fields, and held my course. The sine wave rose, the tension held. I took the summons to the writing desk, powered up my field laptop, and slid the flash drive labeled chimes into the port. The passphrase screen appeared like a door I had already opened. The folders waited in clean rows. I selected Hallway West. The timestamps marched along the bottom. Winter afternoons, early evenings, ordinary hours that carried the weight of intent. The lens stared down the corridor outside Grandma's study. Faded rose wallpaper, a blue vase, the wicker mail basket. Evelyn stepped into frame in a silk blouse. She glanced both ways, her hand dipped. She lifted envelopes. My name faced the camera. She tore the flap with a smooth, practiced motion, scanned, folded, slid the letter into her purse, slipped a gardening catalog onto the table as camouflage. The pattern repeated on 3 dates. The same posture, the same theft of paper and voice. I opened foyer. The front door filled the frame. Light flared across the tiles. A courier held a clipboard. Grandma signed with steady strokes. She lifted an envelope addressed to me and smiled like the name warmed her hand. Later in the clip, Evelyn intercepted the same envelope at the credenza. She peeled a corner. She frowned. She fed the page into a shredder we kept for old bills. Thin gray ribbons fell like tired confetti. Her face stayed smooth. Mailbox showed the metal door on its hinge. A small camera tucked under the flag watched comings and goings. Twice a week, Evelyn arrived before noon. She sorted on the hood of her car, letters to Grandma on the left, letters to Miranda on the right. Then she pushed the right stack into a tote and shut the lid. A neighbor waved. Evelyn lifted the left stack with a smile and a story the microphone barely caught. My sister is deployed again. Mail is complicated. I will handle it. I opened calls. Scans of phone bills line the screen. Grandma's number. My number. Time circled in blue ink. The index linked to audio from the landline recorder she kept by habit. I clicked a date 2 autumns ago. The ringtone sounded soft. My voice answered. Hers followed. Warm, thinner. Then I wanted to remember. We spoke about weather, about sleep, about the sound of the chimes at dawn. Then, another entry, winter. Her breathing a little shorter. A third, spring. Laughter catching on the edge of a cough. I clicked the final file. The label read, Last Porch Evening. Wind brushed the microphone. The chimes moved. Her voice steadied itself. Don't be afraid, my girl. I know everything. One day, justice will arrive, she exhaled. The chimes replied. The line clicked off with the small finality of porcelain settling on a shelf. I sat still. The words traveled through my ribs and found a place to stand. Heat gathered behind my eyes and then receded. Discipline made room for feeling and then folded it away. I opened front porch. The camera watched the steps and rail. Evelyn told a visitor I would skip Thanksgiving because I preferred hero parties on base. The date matched the night I had slept in my car outside the gate when my key failed in the lock. In another clip, a delivery driver held out a padded Envelope with my name. Evelyn signed and carried it inside. It never left by the same door. I returned to the amendment. The clause was clean. Proof triggered forfeit. The trustee had a duty to act. Without delay, I took photographs of the screen. I exported the clips. I generated hash values for each file. I wrote the numbers by hand in the little journal my grandmother had given me when flying was still a dream on paper. Chain of custody matters. Precision is armor. I have worn armor of different kinds. I called Mr. Preston's secure line and left a measured message. No outrage, no tremor, only dates, folders, and the instruction my grandmother had already signed. I printed a short index and laid it on top of the petition that named me unstable. The two stacks looked at each other across the wood grain like rival weather systems. Outside, the afternoon thinned toward gold. I stepped onto the porch and let the wind carry the scent of cut grass and the distant river. The chime set a tempo the heart could keep. I thought of the valley of wind holds and patient marks of choosing 1 second and spending it without waste. This would be the same evidence first, motion second, courtroom third. I placed the flash drive back in its cloth envelope. I locked the metal box. I studied my breath. Feeling rose, feeling settled. The line held. The quiet fight had begun in full. The county courthouse was smaller than I expected. It sat on a quiet street between a shuttered hardware store and a church with a leaning steeple. Inside, fluorescent light hummed above metal benches and the air smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. The clerk led me into a courtroom no bigger than a classroom. The walls were pale, the floor tiled, and the cold light fell across the polished tables where paper and intent waited. My family was already there. Evelyn sat with her hands folded, her hair perfectly arranged, eyes lowered like an actress in rehearsal. My parents flanked her, their suits sharp, their expressions rehearsed into concern. 2 cousins lingered in the back row, phones off, but curiosity alive in their posture. Across the aisle, the attorney they had hired, a tall man in a gray pinstripe, adjusted his cufflinks and smiled as if the outcome were already engraved. The judge, an older woman with steel-cold hair and no visible patience, called the session to order. The petitioner's lawyer stood first. His voice was smooth, every syllable wrapped in polish. "Your Honor," he said, "we are here because this family faces an urgent risk. Colonel Miranda Hale, though decorated and undoubtedly brave, suffers the lingering psychological effects of prolonged combat service. Her judgment under stress may falter. The estate left by her grandmother is vast. Without the court's intervention, mismanagement is imminent and irreversible." He clicked a remote and a screen behind him flickered to life. Images from my service appeared in sequence. Me crouched behind a wall of broken stone. Desert wind whipping my hair. Me cradling a wounded airman. My face drawn tight. Me in a helicopter, goggles reflecting flares against the night sky. In the last photo taken by an embedded journalist, my eyes were red and wet with grit and fatigue. The lawyer paused the frame, letting the image hang. "This," he said, turning to the judge, "is a woman carrying invisible scars. She has isolated herself, speaks rarely to family, and reacts to sudden noise with fear. The family's concern is not greed, but safety for her and for the legacy entrusted to her care." The room went silent except for the low hum of the lights. My pulse stayed steady. I had learned long ago that silence can be armor if you hold it long enough. I kept my hands folded on the table and waited until the lawyer had stacked his papers and taken his seat. The judge turned to me. "Colonel Hale, do you wish to respond?" I rose, smoothed the crease of my uniform, and spoke softly. "Yes, Your Honor. I served my country for 20 years. I have been under fire and I have lost friends. I know what stress looks like and I know how to manage it. My grandmother knew it too. She prepared for this day. With the court's permission, I would like to present evidence." The bailiff carried my laptop to the evidence screen. I opened the folder labeled Chimes. This is camera footage from my grandmother's home, I said. Installed at her request. It documents interference with my mail and communication. The first video rolled. Evelyn in the hallway tearing an envelope with my name on it and sliding the contents into her purse. Gasps rippled across the room. The second clip played, her feeding another letter into the shredder, the thin strips falling into the bin like gray rain. My parents shifted. Evelyn stared at the table as if the grain might open and swallow her. Next, I said, is a recorded call from her landline timestamped 6 months before her passing. I pressed play. My grandmother's voice, thin but steady, filled the courtroom. Don't be afraid, my girl. I know everything. One day, justice will arrive. The judge's pen stopped moving. The lawyer and pinstripes froze mid-page. Behind me, a cousin inhaled sharply, and the sound bounced in the cold room like a dropped coin. This, I said, is why she created a conditional amendment. Anyone who blocked my letters, intercepted my calls, or defamed me forfeits their claim automatically. Mr. Preston, the trustee, holds the originals. I am simply honoring her wishes. The judge leaned back. Have the petitioners reviewed this evidence? The attorney stammered. We were not aware. Vertical spike. The silence cracked into whispers. My family's performance faltered. My mother's hand twitched toward Evelyn, who sat rigid, face pale. My father stared at the table, jaw tight. The cousins in the back whispered to each other, their earlier confidence draining into awe and disbelief. I returned to my seat and folded my hands again. My heart stayed calm. This was the lesson of the valley and the chimes. Observe, wait, and move only when it matters. In that cold courtroom, I felt my grandmother's presence like the weight of a steady hand on my shoulder. Justice, quiet and precise, had finally stepped into the light. The judge recessed for 10 minutes, leaving the courtroom in a charged silence. Papers rustled, shoes scuffed the tile, and the hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space where my family's confidence had once been. I remained seated at my table, hands folded, breathing even. Across the aisle, the performance cracked. My mother leaned in toward my father, her whisper sharp enough to cut. This is your fault. You said she would never find out. You said Evelyn had it under control. My father's face flushed. Dark red. He jabbed a finger toward Evelyn without looking at her. She was supposed to handle it. We agreed she would manage the mail. She said Miranda never called back. She said the letters were pointless. I trusted her to keep it neat. Evelyn flinched. For the first time that day, the polished composure slipped. Tears welled at the edges of her eyes, catching the cold light. You told me to do it, she whispered, voice trembling. You both told me to. You said it was the only way to protect the estate. I didn't want to shred them, but you said Miranda wouldn't care. Mother's hand gripped her purse until the leather squeaked. We didn't tell you to put it on camera. We didn't tell you to be careless. All of this, she gestured wildly at the evidence screen, now dark, is because you couldn't be discreet. The judge's clerk returned, reminding them to keep their voices down. But the damage was done. The cousins in the back row exchanged looks of shock and glee. The kind of fascination people feel when a house they thought was solid shows the first signs of collapse. My father turned fully to Evelyn now, his voice dropping, but no less lethal. Do you realize what you've cost us? Do you realize she has every recording, every shredder clip, every phone bill? We could have argued sentiment, confusion, anything but this. Now it's fraud. It's breach. It's over. Evelyn shook her head, tears spilling freely. I didn't want to hurt her. I thought if she stayed away, I would finally be enough. You always wanted me to be the one in the pictures, the one with the keys. I thought that was love. Her voice cracked on the last word. For a heartbeat, the courtroom felt smaller, like the walls leaned in to hear the confession. I watched her through the stillness, and for the first time in years, her eyes met mine without malice. Regret lived there, raw and unguarded. "I'm sorry, Miranda," she said so quietly. The judge had to lean forward to catch it. "I really am. I thought I was doing what they wanted. I thought if I made you disappear, they would finally see me." The words landed, heavier than any accusation. My chest tightened, but I stayed silent. Years of training taught me that sometimes silence speaks louder than any rebuke. The sine wave of the moment shifted. Intensity broke into a soft descent, not of peace, but of exhausted truth. My parents recoiled from her apology as if it were poison. Mother shook her head, muttering, "Foolish girl," while father faced forward, jaw locked, unwilling to acknowledge either guilt or grief. The lawyer in the pinstriped suit sank into his chair, the sheen of victory long gone. He flipped through his notes, without seeing them, as if ink and paper could reverse the tide. The judge re-entered, her eyes scanning the room. With measured patience, she said nothing about the whispered accusations or the tears. She didn't have to. The collapse of the family had already spoken louder than any gavel. When the session resumed, the formalities felt hollow. My family sat fragmented, no longer a unified force, but a cluster of separate storms. Blame, regret, and silence, swirling in their own corners. I felt the shift deep in my bones. The battle in court was mine, but the war inside, their walls had detonated from within. I exhaled slowly, my hands still steady, and let the quiet settle over the wreckage of everything they had tried to build against me. The wave had risen, broken, and now it receded into the low hum of family tragedy. The judge returned with a thin stack of orders and a voice that did not waver. She reviewed the record, the amendment, the videos, the audio recordings, and the trust's affidavit. Then she ruled the will is valid. The conditional amendment is enforceable. The petition for guardianship is denied. The temporary restraints are dissolved. Any claimant who interfered with my communications or reputation forfeits remaining rights in the estate. The court finds no credible evidence that I am unfit to manage or to serve as personal representative. The sound that followed was not quite a gasp. It was air leaving a punctured tire. My mother studied the floor as if it might open. My father kept a rigid posture, bracing for a wave that had already broken. Evelyn closed her eyes and nodded once. Sorrow, not theater. The judge set a short status conference for administrative housekeeping and thanked counsel for their professionalism. The irony stayed untouched between tables. I signed for certified copies. The seal pressed a round bruise of ink. Outside, winter light turned the sidewalk into a pale ribbon. A handful of local reporters waited. Not a scrum, just faces from school parades and county fairs. I stepped into the air. The flag snapped on its pole. The cold set a clean edge. Someone asked if I felt vindicated. I said the court had honored my grandmother's wishes. Someone else asked if I pied my family. I said I wished we had found a better road before we needed a judge. By evening, the county paper posted its headline, "Colonel inherits farm. Family rebuked. Judge cites secret recordings." The lead photo showed me at the door. Uniform simple. Hair pulled back. Jaw set in a line I did not rehearse. Comments gathered like drift beneath the article. Some called me heartless and said I should split the estate. Others called me disciplined and said the law had finally favored a woman who served. A national blog grabbed the story and sharpened it for clicks, framing it as culture war. The nuance fell away. Talk radio made room in the commute hour. One host said military discipline does not equal financial wisdom. Another said the public loves a uniform until the wearer stops apologizing. A retired JAG officer explained the amendment in patient sentences. His voice sounded like granite. He said, "The law is a ledger. Write in ink." A local pastor wrote an op-ed arguing that forgiveness and accountability are not opposites. They walk the same road at different speeds. Then came the clip. A bystander recorded me leaving the courthouse, pausing to let an elderly man pass with a walker, then stepping into the light. The frame stayed steady. The audio caught the flag snapping and the automatic door sighing shut. The caption was simple. She did not gloat. She just left. The video moved faster than the article. On one platform, comments formed clean opposing columns. She looks cold. She looks composed. She looks like someone who has done this before. She looks tired. One user wrote that discipline without compassion hardens into ice. Another replied that compassion without boundaries becomes a wound. I read enough to take the measure, then closed the apps. Public weather shifts by the hour. A pilot respects wind. A pilot does not argue with it. Voicemail filled with strangers who said they were proud, with others who said I had broken an ancient rule. I saved a message from a former crew chief who remembered my voice on the radio during a bad night. The clip had dropped him back into a hangar where we counted the living and promised to bring the rest home. Before bed, I walked the fence line. The stars had not changed their habits. The house creaked like a ship in harbor. Through the kitchen window, I watched steam rise from a kettle left on low. It curled and disappeared. A small weather system of my own making. The paper posted a balanced follow-up. Not everyone read that far. An email from Mr. Preston arrived with the signed orders and a note about the trust's next steps. Another email from a reporter asked for comment on the family's reaction. I archived it without reply. At midnight, I stood on the porch and let the cold set its teeth in my sleeves. The chime struck a slow measure. Metal touching. Metal, patient and clear. Somewhere a dog barked. The sound thinned into distance. I thought about mercy, about what it does and does not require. I thought about how we sometimes pretend to love people by letting them land punches and calling it care. The court had finished one kind of work. The other kind would begin in kitchens and on porches, without cameras, without seals. When I finally slept, the phone lay face down on the dresser. The orders rested in a folder beside my grandmother's letter. The decision would be parsed by strangers in coffee lines. For me, it meant the ground had stopped sliding. The house had found its footings again. Justice is not a fanfare. It is a level surface. You feel it when your weight no longer tilts to one side. I drove home from the courthouse with the heater low and the radio silent. The farm met with long shadows and a sky rinsed clean by wind. Inside, the house felt larger than it had in years. Victory can make rooms ring. I set the folder with the orders on the dining table next to a bowl that still smelled of lemons and soap. Footsteps did not answer. The walls held their breath. I walked the hallway slowly, touching the frames of photographs without pausing to study the faces. At the end, my grandmother's bedroom waited with its familiar order. Quilt tight, curtains straight, a glass of water on the nightstand with a ring of sunlight caught in its rim. I opened the window an inch and let the cold lift the scent of lavender. The chimes on the porch answered with a cautious song. Metal greeting wind like old friends who speak in few words. In the study I found the journal she had given me when I was a child. The leather cover was cracked where my thumbs always pressed. I opened to the first page, the pencil still faint but legible. I had written in a hand that wandered, I want to fly high. Like a hawk. The letters rose and fell like little hills. The sentence was more hope than grammar. It felt true anyway. I sat on the floor with my back against the bookshelf and read entries I barely remembered writing. Drawings of wings, measurements of model planes, a list of chores I traded for extra time at the county airfield, a pledge to save lawn money for flight lessons. I remembered the first time I touched a yoke. The trainers smelled like vinyl and dust. The runway narrowed into a ribbon. The earth fell away, not with arrogance, but with gratitude. My grandmother had stood at the fence and waved like she was sending a ship. I stood and turned off the kitchen light so the stars could get closer. From the sink window, the field looked like water under the moon. A fox crossed near the fence and paused, sure of its own country. I thought about the Judges' words and about the headlines already circling town like small weather systems and about my sister's face when the recordings played. The anger I expected did not arrive. What came instead was a clean ache, the kind that does not seek an audience. I made tea and carried the mug to the porch. The board spoke under my weight. The cold brought out the iron smell in the nails. I stood beside the bell my grandfather had bolted to the post a lifetime ago and listened to the field breathe. Somewhere a truck downshifted. The sound faded. The wind kept its slower rhythm. I thought about what to build here that would be worthy of her letter and worthy of the land. A plan began to take shape. Practical and quiet. A workshop in the old barn for veterans learning to repair tools. A classroom in the sunroom for local kids who like to take apart radios and rebuild them into weather stations. A weekly breakfast where nobody has to explain why crowded rooms hurt. Not charity, not spectacle. A place to practice steadiness until it becomes part of the bones. I wrote short lines in the journal under the sentence about the hawk. The page accepted ink the way fields accept rain. I closed the book and pressed it to my chest for a breath. In the distance, a train called and was answered by another. The sound traced an old route through the valley and on toward the coast, taking freight and secrets. This house had carried its own share. Some were heavy, some were bright. Tonight it held only the weight I chose to keep. I went room to room and opened the interior doors so the air could turn. I set a chair upright in the corner, folded a blanket, cleaned the kettle spout. Simple things align a day after complicated ones. When I finished, I returned to the porch and watched the last porch light in town blink out. The chimes settled into a final bar, then waited. I did not feel triumphant. I felt ready. Tomorrow would bring more questions and probably more talk shows and more strangers with advice. Let them talk. I would take the first step of the plan before breakfast and another step after lunch and a third before the stars came back. The hawk in that first sentence was not chasing glory. It was finding lift. I closed the door softly and let the house keep watch while I slept. Spring settled over the farm like a quiet handshake. The frost retreated to the edges of the fence lines, and the soil turned soft under the heel. I walked the property with a notebook in hand and my grandmother's journal tucked into my jacket pocket. Her words had become a compass, and the inheritance she left me felt less like a trophy and more like raw material. I chose the far field beyond the old barn for the first project. It had enough open ground for tents and low ropes, and the creek nearby could serve as a natural obstacle and a place to sit and listen to water speak. I drew rough plans, a survival course, a fire circle, a simple Baroque-style lodge that could host weekend retreats. This would not be a museum of my victories. It would be a place for others to find their balance, the way I had found mine under the desert sky and in the quiet of this porch. Within 2 months, hammers and saws replaced the silence. Local contractors helped me convert the barn into a gear shed and a classroom. A retired Marine named Carter, who ran the county hardware store, volunteered to teach basic carpentry to high school kids who wanted summer jobs. He said he came for the work, but stayed for the coffee and the smell of cut pine. We called it the Hale Training and Resilience Camp. Invitations went to nearby VA centers and youth programs. The first weekend brought 12 veterans and 6 teenagers, all of them strangers, all of them weary. I met them by the fire pit, the air scented with fresh cedar chips. We start simple, I told them. Shelter, fire, water, navigation. You learn how to stand steady in the woods, and you'll find you can stand steadier in the world. The first micro spike came that evening. A former Army medic named Louis sat by the fire with his hands buried in his pockets. He hadn't smiled all day. Then, one of the teenagers, a lanky kid named Micah, accidentally dropped a marshmallow into the flames. The goo caught, hissed, and launched like a comet onto Louis's boot. Micah yelped. Louis jumped, and for the first time in months, according to his sister, he laughed. A deep surprise laugh that rolled around the circle like a warm front. The next day, we ran the low rope course. Teams worked in pairs, veteran and teen. They lifted, spotted, and encouraged one another over walls and through suspended logs. Music played softly from a portable speaker, simple acoustic guitar, the kind that eases the air instead of filling it. I watched from the edge, my boots in the grass, and felt the rhythm of something I had almost forgotten. Joy without noise. Evenings ended with reflection. We sat in a circle, the fire a steady heart in the center, and shared moments of gratitude. A Navy mechanic said he finally slept through a night without checking the door. A 16-year-old girl said she had never talked to a soldier before, but now wanted to write letters to those still deployed. I wrote in my journal that night, "The camp is not mine. It belongs to anyone who finds a piece of themselves here." The local paper ran a small feature titled "From Courtroom to Campfire, Colonel Hale's Quiet Mission." Photos showed veterans teaching teens how to start fires with flint. And one picture caught a group laughing mid-struggle over a tarp in the wind. Comments under the article were kind for once. Healing looks like work and dirt under the nails. By summer's end, we had run 4 sessions. The barn smelled of rope, pine, and coffee. The flag outside lifted in the breeze above the words stankled on a wooden arch, "Hold your course." My grandmother would have approved. The house, once heavy with echoes, now carried footsteps and the low hum of purpose. The 5th weekend of camp began on a cool Saturday morning. Dew clung to the grass, and the first group of teens had just finished raising tents with the help of 2 veterans. I was adjusting a pulley line near the rope course when a car slowed on the gravel drive. It was an older sedan, clean but plain. The door opened and Evelyn stepped out. I almost didn't recognize her. Gone were the silk dresses, the high heels, the polished armor she wore in every family photo. She had on jeans, a navy hoodie, and sneakers that looked new but humble. Her hair was pulled back without fuss, and for the first time, her eyes met mine without calculation. She walked up, slowly, hands in her pockets, stopping just shy of the rope course. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," she said, her voice catching on the morning air. "I know I don't deserve that yet. I want to help this place." She glanced around at the flags, the laughter of kids carrying water buckets, the veterans giving quiet instruction. "It feels like something worth protecting." I studied her for a long breath. The past didn't vanish, but it softened around the edges. I nodded once. "We don't need apologies to start work. We need hands that show up." Her shoulders lowered, attention breaking. "I can organize supplies, run errands, whatever you need. I'm good at lists and I want to learn from them too. Maybe it's time I build something that's not about me." That afternoon, Evelyn carried crates of rope and harnesses from the barn to the field. She listened more than she spoke. A retired medic showed her how to secure a line knot for the climbing wall, and she fumbled, then laughed quietly at herself. It was the first shared laugh between us in over a decade. The sine wave of the moment rose and then softened. Watching her hand a water bottle to a teenage camper, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief, not absolution, not trust restored overnight, but the first stone of a bridge placed in clean soil. At sunset, we gathered at the fire pit. The veterans told stories, and the teens leaned in, catching pieces of courage and humor. Evelyn sat across from me, her face lit by the flames. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away. In that silence, I offered her the only forgiveness I believed in. Opportunity, not words. She stayed to stack wood after the fire dimmed. And when she left, she promised to come back next Saturday. I stood on the porch later that night, journal in hand, and wrote, "Sometimes redemption doesn't knock. It just shows up ready to work." The chimes on the porch swayed in a gentle wind. And for the first time, their song carried no ache, only a quiet, enduring hope. I found it on a quiet Sunday after the campers left. The house held its breath the way empty houses do between footsteps. Sunlight crossed the desk in Grandma's study and turned the dust to slow gold. I opened the middle drawer to file receipts, pushed past pencils, and paper clips, and felt a ridge at the back. A press with my thumb, and a thin panel lifted, a shallow compartment. Weighted, lined with linen. In the color of cream. In it lay a small pocket watch. A nickel case scuffed to a soft shine by years of hands. I pressed the crown. The lid sprang. A clean tick rose. Like a tiny heart. Inside the lid, an engraving caught the light. For words. Simple and absolute. You're my pride. My throat tightened as if the phrase had. Wait. I have seen medals pinned and orders stamped. None of them felt like this little circle of metal that knew my name. I checked the time. The hands made their steady promises. I listened. The rhythm studied something in me that the courtroom had shaken. I closed the watch and felt the tick continue through the case. Persistence without fanfare. I kept it open on the desk while I sorted. The drawer. At the back lay stamps, a roll of twine, and a folded recipe card. For peach cobbler in Grandma's hand. Ordinary things that make a life. I slipped the watch into the pocket of my field jacket and walked to the porch. The chimes answered the door with a bright, quick run. Outside, the training field glowed under a high blue sky. Tense stitched shadows across the grass. The rope course cast neat lines. Veterans checked carabiners. Teenagers joked in the careful way kids do when they are happy and not sure it is allowed. Guitar notes drifted from the barn. Not a performance, a kindness. I crossed to the range. Luis was setting paper targets and coaching breath control. In through the nose, hold. Let it go slow. His words rode the air like a steadying hand. A shy boy I know as. Theo lifted his shoulders, then let them drop. His hands stopped weaving. The first shot went wide, the second brushed the ring, the third cut the paper clean. He exhaled. I nodded. The pocket watch ticked against my rib. At the creek, a retired crew chief taught knots. A girl with a blue bandana curled her tongue in concentration and finally set a bow line. That held under a hard tug. Her smile started small and spread until it brought her friend with it. Small victories stacked into a wall you could lean on. That I thought is a legacy fit. For the ground that raised me. Near noon, I unfolded topo maps on a plywood table. We traced ridges with fingertips. We matched contour to skyline. We learned to let the land teach us its grammar. A boy said the lines looked like ribs. I told him mountains breathe. Learning to read them is learning to listen. At lunch we ate in the shade of the barn. Peanut butter sandwiches. Apples, black coffee, and tin mugs. I read the engraving again and weighed what pride ought to mean. Not noise, not trophies. The quiet courage of showing up and allowing others room to stand. After lunch, we hiked the East Knob. The sun sharpened edges. Cycas stitched the heat into one long seam. At the overlook, I raised the watch. Sunlight flashed brief and clean. I am keeping time for this place. Time to try. Time to fail. Time to try again. No one rushes here. No one gets left behind. On the way down, we passed the balance log. A veteran who avoids crowds stepped onto the beam. His breath shortened, his hands lifted. Without a word, 3 kids in Carter formed a soft circle with outstretched arms. The log shook, steadied. He crossed. Near the end he laughed at himself and the sound annoted the air. That was the day's micro spike, not dramatic, decisive. The guitar rose from the barn. The chimes carried a high counterpoint. Laughter braided with both and became a kind of weather. By late afternoon, the field looked like a living painting. Coiled ropes lay in tidy piles. Water cans caught sun. Footprints stitched light brown paths in the grass. I walked the fence line and pictured what else could grow here without turning the place into a brochure. A small machine shed for repairs, a quiet room with heavy chairs. And a shelf of paperbacks, a garden for hands that need to touch soil before words will come. I stopped beside the arch Carter built from barnwood. We carved 4 words across the beam. Hold your course. The letters looked like they had always been there. They felt earned. I checked the watch again. The tick held. The hands had traveled, but had not rushed. I thought of Grandma speaking softly on a porch night, how she would pause so I could learn the space between sentences. I looked across the training ground and saw children practicing fire kits while veterans coached. I saw a teenager teach a younger boy to read a compass with patience that had not been there last month. The sun dropped toward honey. The wind rose just enough to move the chimes. Their voice met the laughter on the field and made a chord that did not need words. I opened the watch one more time and pressed my thumb over the engraving. You are my pride. I answered it by making myself small enough to make room. By building a place where pride is permission, not pressure. Where the measure of a day is whether someone found steadier ground. When the last tent stake was seated and the last coil of rope hung, I walked back to the porch. Inside the study waited, neat and warm. I set the watch on the desk where the light could find it again. I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned. The will had given me land. The watch had given me a way to spend it. Legacy would not be marble or a speech. It would be a steady instrument. The chimes in a friendly wind, the field alive with people learning how to stand. I stood on the porch as the day thinned to gold. The pocket watch lay warm in my palm. The engraving caught a last thread of light. All that my grandmother left was not only land and money. It was the right to stand upright in the world, without asking for permission. It was a path for building, not a stage for boasting. The chimes swung once, twice. Their small song carried far across the field. I spoke in the voice I use when the wind is almost still. Everything we kept here matters because it teaches a simple practice. We hold time for one another. We make room for first tries. We forgive with work, not slogans. We let people arrive as they are and leave a little steadier than they came. On the range, a boy gathered his paper targets. On the rope course, a veteran coiled the last line and set it gently in a crate. The camp exhaled. Laughter slowed. Boots scuffed lightly on wood. I lifted my eyes and the field answered with life. Children jogged between cones. Veterans walked the boundary in quiet conversation. Carter waved from the barn, with a mug raised in salute. The guitar drifted again. 2 chords, a third, a friendly cadence. The breeze turned, the chimes replied. Metal, wood, voices, a small community keeping time together. That was the micro spike I wanted to remember. Not surprise, recognition. I set the watch against my heart and pictured Grandma at this rail. Her hand on my shoulder, her approval quiet and complete. Justice had done its work. Consequences had fallen where they belonged. What remained was the long work of healing. Forgiveness had a face now. It stacked wood, fetched water, learned knots, and showed up on Saturdays. Evelyn would be here in the morning. She would carry rope and listen more than she spoke. Opportunity would be our only language. The light thinned into silver. I looked down at the dial. The second hand drew its confident circle. I spoke to the camera the way I would speak to a friend. All that my grandmother left was not only land and money. It was the right to stand upright in the world without needing anyone's approval. If you have been told to shrink, I hope you hear the chimes. If you have been asked to earn love by disappearing, I hope you feel this porch under your feet and decide to stay. The pocket watch flashed as the last beam of sun crossed the deck. The chimes answered with one bright note and then another closing motif, simple and clear. Metal and light, a promise kept. Before we say goodbye, we would love to know where you are watching from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Tell us in the comments. We raid everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not only to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you and remember this truth. Sometimes the miracle does not knock on your door. It waits quietly until you are ready to open your heart. Take care. We will see you in the next story.